My fiancée demanded I send my orphaned kids to boarding school so her brother could take their rooms. I refused and she destroyed my reputation. But when her brother stole thousands from her and she came begging for help, my answer left her broken. I'm 38 years old. I work as a civil engineer. And 3 years ago, I lost my wife in a car accident that basically split my life in two. I was left alone with two kids, Noah, who was 9 at the time, and Emma, who was 7. And honestly, the first months were absolute hell because I didn't know how to do anything. I mean, my wife was the one who handled everything at home, the kids' routines, food, everything. And suddenly I was there trying to make breakfasts and braids and homework and not sleep more than 3 hours straight because Emma had nightmares every single night. We spent like 2 years like that, just the three of us trying to survive and find a new normal. And honestly, I thought that's how it was going to be forever. That my romantic life was over and my job was just to be a dad, and I was okay with that. Seriously, my kids were my priority, and that was it. But then, like a year and a half ago, I met Jennifer at a barbecue that a friend from work organized. She was 34, worked in marketing for a tech company. And I don't know, there was something about her that caught my attention from the start. She was fun and confident. And when I told her I was a widower with 2 kids, she didn't run away like other women I had tried to date. We started talking that night, and then exchanged numbers and basically started dating casually. Nothing serious at first, because I didn't want to bring anyone into my kids' lives until I was completely sure. You know what I mean? The kids had already been through enough trauma, and I wasn't going to introduce them to someone who might not stick around. The first few months we only went out just the 2 of us. Dinners after the kids were asleep or Saturday morning coffees when they stayed with my parents. And honestly, Jennifer seemed to understand it perfectly. She never pressured me to meet Noah and Emma, always said she respected my time and that we were going at our own pace. After like 6 months, I told her I wanted her to meet the kids, that things between us were going well, and that if this was going to be something serious, I needed to know how everyone was going to connect. I remember that first meeting. I took her out for pizza on a Sunday, and Noah was super quiet and suspicious, because he was 11 and was very protective of me and Emma after losing his mom. But Emma opened up faster and started talking to Jennifer about school and her friends. And at first everything seemed perfect. Jennifer made the effort to connect with the kids, asked them about their stuff, played video games with Noah, even though she had no idea what she was doing, helped Emma with art projects, and I thought, this is it. This is the person who's going to complete our family. We spent like 8 months like that, building this relationship. And the kids started to really accept her. Not as a replacement for their mom, because that was never going to happen, but as someone important in our lives. Jennifer started staying over. Some weekends, cooked with us, we'd go to the park all together, like it seemed she really cared about us. So like 10 months ago, I decided to propose to her. I took her to the same park where I had taken my wife years before. That place had a lot of meaning for me, and I asked her if she wanted to marry me and officially be part of our family. Jennifer started crying and said yes, that it was what she wanted most in the world, that she loved the kids, and we were going to be so happy together. I had told Noah and Emma before proposing, obviously, because I needed to know they were comfortable with the idea, and they both said it seemed fine to them, that Jennifer was nice and that if I was happy they were too. We started planning the wedding for the following summer, nothing too big, just close family and some friends. We wanted something intimate and special. But then, and this was like 2 months after the engagement, Jennifer started making weird comments about the house. She'd say things like, we needed to redecorate everything, that it looked too childish with all the kids' drawings on the fridge and their toys everywhere, and I'd tell her, yeah, we could make some changes, but at the end of the day it was the kids' house too, and they needed to feel comfortable. She'd smile and say, yes, of course. But I was starting to notice this tone in her voice that I didn't like she was holding back from saying what she really thought. One day we were looking at house photos on Pinterest or whatever, and she pointed to a super elegant guest room and said, imagine having a room like that instead of so much space wasted on toys. And I was like, what? But I didn't give it much importance at that moment. Then her brother Daniel appeared in the conversation, and I have to admit, I should have paid more attention from the start. Jennifer would mention Daniel from time to time, said he was 36 and going through a rough time, that he couldn't hold down a steady job, and basically, lived crashing with different friends. I asked her what kind of problems he had, and she was vague, said something about bad luck and bad decisions, but nothing specific. And since I didn't know him, I didn't think much about it. But as the weeks went by, Jennifer talked more and more about Daniel, about how much he needed help, how his family had abandoned him, that she was the only one who cared about him. I'd tell her I was sorry, that it sounded complicated, but honestly, I didn't see how that affected us. Then one night, this was like 6 months ago, we were having dinner, the four of us, Jennifer, me and the kids, and out of nowhere, Jennifer asks Noah and Emma if they'd ever considered going to boarding school. The kids stared at her like she'd asked them if they wanted to go live on Mars, and I also froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. Noah said no. Why would he leave his home? And Emma just shook her head really fast, like clearly uncomfortable. Jennifer laughed and said she was just asking, that she'd heard about some really good boarding schools where kids learned independence and made friends from all over the world, and I told her, Jennifer, they're not going to any boarding school. They're perfectly fine here at home with me. She just smiled and said, of course. It was just conversation, but I felt something cold in my stomach, like a warning that something wasn't right. After the kids went to bed that night, I asked her what all that boarding school stuff was about, and she said she was just exploring options, that maybe it would be good for them to have new experiences. And I told her very clearly, my kids aren't going to any boarding school, period. And she got defensive and said she was just trying to help, that she didn't understand why I was getting so aggressive. We had our first serious fight that night. We didn't yell because the kids were sleeping, but it was tense. And I went to bed feeling horrible but also confused because I didn't understand where that idea had come from. Like 2 weeks later, Jennifer told me we needed to talk about something important. We sat in the living room after the kids went to bed, and she started by saying that Daniel really needed a place to stay, that he'd lost another job, and the friend he was living with was going to kick him out any moment. I told her I was sorry, but I didn't see how we could help, that we didn't have an extra room, and she looked at me like I was the stupidest person in the world and said, well, if the kids were at boarding school, we'd have 2 rooms available. And that's when everything clicked in my head. When I understood that the boarding school conversation hadn't been casual, that it had been the beginning of her plan to get her brother into my house by getting my kids out. I sat there processing what I'd just heard. Literally couldn't believe she was suggesting sending my kids away so her adult brother I didn't even know could live with us. I said, Jennifer, are you serious? Are you really suggesting I send Noah and Emma to boarding school so Daniel can have his room? And she got super defensive, started saying I didn't understand how hard it was for Daniel, that he was her brother and she had the responsibility to help him, that the kids would be better off in a structured environment with other kids their age, that that's what well-off families did, basically justifying it in 1,000 different ways. I told her no, absolutely not, that my kids had lost their mother 3 years ago, and there was no way I was sending them away from their home, and from me, to accommodate an adult they didn't know who, apparently couldn't take care of himself. Jennifer got really angry, said I was selfish, that I didn't see the big picture, that if I really loved her, I'd find a way to help her brother. And I told her that if she really loved me and loved my kids, she wouldn't be asking me to send them away. The conversation got uglier and uglier. She started crying and saying that maybe she'd made a mistake getting engaged to someone who already had kids, that she thought we could be a family, but I was always going to put my kids first. And I told her, yes, exactly. I was always going to put my kids first, because that's what parents do. That night she left angry to her apartment, and I stayed up until 4 a.m, wondering if I'd seen signs that I ignored, if all the time she spent with the kids had just been an act to get to this moment. For the next 2 weeks, Jennifer called and texted me constantly trying to convince me. She'd send me links to boarding schools, articles about the benefits of independent education, testimonials from kids who supposedly loved being away from home, like she was obsessed with this idea. I'd respond the same thing every time, that it wasn't going to happen, but she wouldn't accept my answer. She'd tell me to at least consider it, to talk to the kids about it, to give them the option to decide, and I'd tell her my kids didn't have to decide anything because the answer was already no. Noah asked me one day why Jennifer hadn't come around in a while, and I told him the truth, that we were having a disagreement about something important. And he asked me if it was about boarding school, and when I said yes, he just said, I don't want to leave, Dad. Please don't send us away. And that broke my heart because a 1-2-year-old kid shouldn't have to worry about his father sending him away. Then, like 4 months ago, on a Saturday morning, someone rings the doorbell. I open the door, and there's this guy I'd never seen, like my age or maybe older, ripped jeans, stained t-shirt, smelling like cigarettes and alcohol, and he tells me, "You must be Thomas." I'm Daniel, Jennifer's brother. And I just stood there like, what the hell? Because Jennifer hadn't told me her brother was coming, and Daniel didn't even wait for me to invite him in. He literally pushed the door and walked into my house saying, "So, this is the place. Not bad. Where's my room?" I followed him inside, completely in shock, and told him, "Your room? You don't have any room here. Who told you you could come?" And he laughed and said Jennifer told him everything was arranged, that the kids were leaving soon and he'd finally have a stable place to stay. Noah and Emma were in the living room watching TV, and they stared at this stranger, who had just walked in like it was his house. And I told them to go upstairs to their rooms, which they did immediately because I think they felt the tension. I told Daniel that Jennifer had lied to him, that nothing was arranged, that my kids weren't going anywhere and he needed to leave my house immediately. He got aggressive, started saying I'd promised his sister I'd help his family. What kind of man was I that couldn't do a simple favor? That it was only temporary until he got a job, and I told him I didn't give a damn what Jennifer had told him, that this was my house and he needed to get out, right then or I was going to call the police. Daniel started yelling at me, saying I was an asshole, that Jennifer deserved someone better, that my kids were spoiled brats who needed to learn to share, basically spewing venom, and I had to literally push him toward the door because he wouldn't leave. I finally managed to get him out and locked the door, and he stood outside yelling for like 10 minutes before finally leaving. I immediately called Jennifer and asked her what the hell had just happened, why her brother had shown up at my house acting like he already lived there, and she started crying, saying she just wanted us to meet, that she thought, if I saw how much Daniel needed help, I'd change my mind. I told her it was incredible that she'd sent her brother to my house without even warning me, that he'd scared my kids, and that we needed to seriously talk about our future because this had gotten completely out of control. We agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop, neutral territory, because I didn't want her near my house or the kids. When I arrived, she was already there, with red eyes from crying, and she immediately started apologizing, saying it had been a mistake to send Daniel without warning, that she was just desperate to help him, that I had to understand. He was her brother, and he had no one else. I told her I understood she wanted to help her family, but it couldn't be at the expense of mine, that my kids were my priority, and if she couldn't accept that, then we couldn't be together. And then she changed completely, stopped crying and looked at me with this coldness I'd never seen in her and said, "So that's it? You're going to choose your kids over me? Over us? Over our future? Together?" And I told her, "Yes, exactly. I'm always going to choose my kids. It's not even a decision. It's just a fact." Jennifer was quiet for a moment and then said that if that was my final decision, then she wanted me to pay her back everything she'd put in for the wedding, that she'd used her savings for the venue, deposit, and catering, and if I was going to cancel everything, then it was my responsibility to reimburse her. I stared at her, unable to believe that literally. At that moment, when our relationship was ending, she was thinking about money, but I told her fine, that I'd send her a check for her half of the deposits, and I got up and left that coffee shop feeling like a weight had been lifted, but also completely betrayed by someone I'd trusted. I thought that was the end. Seriously, I thought Jennifer was going to take her money and leave my life forever. But oh no, things got much worse. Like 2 weeks later, I started getting messages from friends and family asking what had happened, saying Jennifer was saying I'd been abusive with her, that I'd yelled at her in front of the kids, that I'd threatened her, basically making up this whole story that I was a monster. Some people believed me when I explained the truth. Others clearly didn't know what to think, and it was horrible having to defend myself from accusations that were completely false. My mom was furious, wanted to go confront Jennifer herself, but I told her to leave it, that the truth would come out eventually. And then, this was like 2 months ago, I started getting messages from Daniel. At first they were just threatening messages saying I was going to regret treating him badly, that he knew where I lived, that I was going to get what I deserved, like stuff. I honestly considered reporting to the police, but a friend who's a lawyer told me to wait and see if it escalated more. The messages continued for like a week, getting more and more aggressive, and I was starting to seriously worry about my kids' safety, was considering putting up cameras or changing the locks, when suddenly the messages stopped completely. I didn't hear anything from Daniel or Jennifer for like 3 weeks, and honestly, it was a relief. I thought they'd finally understood I wasn't going to change my mind and had left me alone. But then, like a month ago, I get a call from Jennifer, crying hysterically, saying she needed to talk to me, that it was urgent. I didn't want to answer, but something in her voice sounded genuinely desperate, so I told her to tell me what was going on over the phone, that I wasn't going to see her in person. She told me Daniel had stolen thousands of dollars from her bank account, that he'd had access to her cards because she'd been lending him money regularly and he'd memorized the numbers, and he'd emptied practically all her savings. I asked her if she'd gone to the police, and she said no, that Daniel was her brother and she couldn't do that, and I told her then there was nothing I could do for her. Jennifer begged me to help her, to lend her money, to give her a second chance, that she'd understood she'd been wrong about everything with boarding school and Daniel, basically saying what she thought I wanted to hear. I asked her where Daniel was now, and she said she didn't know, that he disappeared after stealing her money, that he wasn't even answering her calls, and I couldn't help thinking it was ironic that the person she'd been willing to sacrifice my relationship with my kids for had betrayed her in the worst possible way. I told her I was sorry for her situation, but I wasn't going to give her money, that she needed to go to the police and report the theft, and not to contact me again. But Jennifer didn't accept my answer, because 2 days later she showed up at my house, literally knocking on the door at 8 at night on a Friday when the kids were watching a movie. I opened the door and there she was. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days, and she immediately started begging, saying she had no one else, that her whole family had abandoned her, that Daniel had ruined her life, that I was her only hope. The kids heard her voice and Noah came out to see what was going on, and I told him to go back to the living room, that everything was fine, but he stood there staring at Jennifer with this expression that was part pity, part disgust. Jennifer saw Noah and tried to talk to him directly, saying she missed him, that she missed Emma too, that she regretted everything that had happened, and I told her not to talk to my kids, that she had no right after everything. She started crying harder, saying she just needed a little help to get back on her feet, that she'd pay me back every cent, that it was just a few $1,000s. And I told her no, that I'd made my decision, and she needed to accept that what we had was over. Jennifer looked at me with this pure hatred and told me I was just like everyone else, that no one had ever been there for her or Daniel, that we weren't so special, that my kids were spoiled brats who didn't know how lucky they were. And that's when I lost my patience. I told her to get off my property immediately, or I was going to call the police, and she laughed with this bitter laugh and said, "Go ahead, call them," that she'd tell them all about how I'd emotionally manipulated her, and then left her with nothing. I took out my phone and dialed 911, and that finally scared her enough to leave. But before she left, she turned around and told me this wasn't over, that I'd regret treating her like this. I closed the door and took a deep breath, and when I turned around, Noah was standing there in the hallway and he told me, "You did the right thing, Dad." She was crazy. It's been like 3 weeks since that, and I haven't heard anything more from Jennifer or Daniel. I got a restraining order just as a precaution, which was surprisingly easy given all the threatening messages I had saved. And honestly, I feel relieved that it's all over, even though part of me still can't believe we got to this point. When I met Jennifer a year and a half ago, I really thought I'd found someone who was going to be good for my kids and me, that we were going to build this new family together, and it's incredible how someone can show a completely different face when things don't go the way they want. Yesterday, Emma asked me if I was ever going to bring another girlfriend home, and I told her, honestly, I didn't know. That for now I was fine just with the two of them, and she hugged me and said she was fine with that too. Noah is still a bit more reserved about the whole thing. I think the experience with Jennifer made him more distrustful, but every now and then he makes comments about how he's glad she's not here anymore, that the house feels calmer. And he's right, honestly, the house does feel calmer. Without all that constant pressure and those impossible expectations Jennifer had been putting on us. I guess at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that my kids are safe and in their home, and that no romantic relationship is going to be worth it if it means putting that at risk.